it does work.
You recording? You not saying nothing?
You want to act up? I'll just record it. The only way I can stop you.
Yo, hey everybody, welcome back to the Spinner Rack. I'm here with the boys, Kyle and Petey. Today we're talking about that book that just dropped by Riesman, The True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. Oh boy, the boys are here. We're going to be talking about it. So, hey, I just want to show you right now. I want to present you to the boys. Petey, say what's up to the peeps.
What's up?
Cal, say what's happening.
Going on, ready to rock.
Remember, if you like what you see, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, any comments there. It's a big help. So, starting off this book, is it a hatchet job or not? This seems to be, people have been talking about this being one of the most definitive biographies of our boy Stan Lee, you know. But the question is it really, or is it a hatchet job? So I'm going to pass this over to our boy, P, to give a little background about this. Tell us a little bit more about this this whole book that you know and what you think about it. And then we're going to pass it on to Cal.
Well, just right now, it feels like, you know, with Stan being almost the last survivor of the Marvel, the original crew that helped create Marvel, which he's not the last survivor. There's still Stan Lee's brother, Larry Lieber. So it's like you had Stan, you had Larry, his brother, you had Jack Kirby, you had Steve Ditko, you have Don Heck, you have Dick Ayers, and you also have all the people in production like Sal Brodsky, the inkers, anyone that was involved, and they molded down into just Stan, and Stan somehow took all the credit, went to Hollywood, and became a huge success. Now, any sort of true biography would need to go to the last people that have been around, which would be Stan Lee's brother and Roy Thomas, who we'll get into later. They didn't sort of interview them for that. They went by stuff said by Kirby that was said in the 80s, not anywhere near the time. And then we also have, stuff by Griffley, one of the biggest historians for Kirby, which would be who wrote this article, The King and I, in the Comics Buyer's Guide, 1060. Mark Evener, who's the classic writer of, he wrote for the cartoon, was it Garfield? He did work for DC Comics. And at some point, they're just taking the pieces where they say Stan believed that anything that was, Jack Kirby believed anytime that he just basically wrote these things by himself. And they're taking that as a science, that any plot they find is something that was done after they had a story conference, and Stan was kind of trying to back up himself as a writer, so he wrote a plot that usually was very different from what was produced. So it'd be kind of odd for it to be produced after the fact. But basically going through his life and then going through the horrors of the end of his life, of how, stuff that didn't work out, all of the stuff in this, towards the end of going to cons and stuff like that. Anything that's negative that they're going in here and saying that they're going through that, trying to turn him into a Bob Kane type figure, a person who took all credit and gave none, when that would be not the case. Stan is one of the few people, one of the first to literally list the credits in the comic books. Because at this point, comic books really didn't care about the credits. You could see in DC books, you can go there. EC, the artists were allowed to sign their work, but a lot of times you didn't know who was behind the scenes, like Harvey Kurtzman, as far as doing some of the layouts and the writing of those books. So there was a lot of unsaid creators, and Stan was one of the first to sort of put the names down, but then they disregarded those names and cut out, since we're only talking about the creation, we're not talking about the successes that happened later with, with John Buscema on the Fantastic Four, John Romita on Spider-Man, and anything else that made Marvel this juggernaut, like the X-Men, Chris Claremont on the X-Men, going further, the stuff with X-Men with Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld, Todd McFarlane. We're not getting into that. We're saying the little company that was struggling to keep up with DC, at some point overtook DC in the 70s. And even at that point, Stan wasn't a household name. Stan wasn't even the person who was supposed to take over Marvel. It was actually supposed to be the publisher's the publisher's son, Chip Goodman, was supposed to take over Marvel, and then ultimately the people who bought Marvel, Cadence, they wanted Stan, and they wanted Stan in a position of power, and they bought it, and they really wanted Stan, and Stan was sort of the voice of Marvel, and that's what he gave to the dialogue, and that's what he gave to the comic books. So that's going to be my start on it. This is as you said, a hatchet job. But you were hinting, is it? I would say it is. So, but he was the last one alive when Kirby was around. He was on the TV show, the Hulk TV show, but Marvel didn't have that many successes after that. It took a while until Blade came along, and then Kirby wasn't around to be public in those successes. But when we had a hit show, Kirby was on the Hulk show. So I mean, it's not like even if Steve Ditko wanted to be involved with Spider-Man, I'm pretty sure Sony would have done everything they could to roll out the carpet for him. But he wanted to move on. He was like, that was the past. Nothing negative towards Marvel about the movies. He's like saying, that's the past. That's not me. Not interested. So he's not someone that, unless you say we needed to give the copyright to Ditko or Kirby, when Stan didn't even own that. So
what do you think, Cal? What's your take on this so far?
It's a straight hatchet job. Most people don't know who Stan Lee was, okay, in terms of comics, and this is even people who read the comics. Okay, most people who are actually, including the person who wrote this biography, this person doesn't seem to know who Stan Lee was either. If you came in reading comics, your first introduction to Stan Lee was that banner at the top of the comic saying Stan Lee presents after the origin. That was your introduction to him. And then maybe a little bit later, you might have learned what he looked like, and he created these characters, so on and so forth. But it would actually take some time to actually do a little bit of reading, and then after that, to actually understand who Stan Lee was. Okay, in respect of everything that happened. Like Petey said, Marvel is this struggling entity in comparison to DC. DC has Superman. Okay, DC, doesn't really need to do too much. They can put out a whole bunch of books, put Superman on the cover, and they can actually generate some income like that. Marvel was still doing a lot of different titles, romance, horror, that's light horror, if you will, sci-fi, but nothing that really took off for them. Then Stan gets the directive, hey, create another Justice League for us. And he discusses it with his wife, and he's like, I don't want to just keep doing the same stuff. And his wife is like, so why don't you do it the way that you want to? And he does a merger of the romance, the horror, the sci-fi, and what do we get? We get the Fantastic Four. Okay, but even that little bit, most people really don't get. Stan is their introduction to Stan is the guy in the movie who's doing these cameos. And then, of course, you can't sell this book. You can't sell this book with the story of, the little engine that could, which is Stan Lee as well. Stan Lee is a guy who's in middle management. Most of the time, these guys don't break out, to become anything. We've never heard of an editor, going on to become this famous or this popular for the creation of characters, or even giving any sort of nod, for the creation of these characters. So that's not a biography that the person can sell. But you can sell a biography about this person who's Machiavellian, stealing credit, marginalizing other people. And a lot of these people also would believe that Stan Lee died wealthy because of the creation of these characters, forgetting that he was an editor. He had no ownership to any of these characters. Everything that he created, Marvel had. So if they're saying, well, he stole, this from Jack, Kirby, he didn't own any of it. He didn't own any of it. And in the same breath of what Petey said, what Stan did was revolutionary for the time, where it was a while before guys even got credit that they even did a book. You would have to, they'd go back far enough. You don't even know who did the book. Stan was like, no, this guy did the book. He gives everybody gives everybody their own nicknames and such. But that was also some personality that he gave to Marvel Comics. I remember this. It was like a little short with him marching, and you see the kids marching behind him, and it's like the Merry Marvel Marching Society. And that was the personality he gave to Marvel Comics. That they were actually speaking, not talking at the reader, but enjoying the books with the reader. Hey, how cool is it? And we get together. We get together for these few short pages. Every month or so. We'll see you next month. Almost like a person of Mr. Rogers, if you will. Just a lot more action and violence. So that guy right over there is the reason why Chip Goodman doesn't get put on, and Stan gets put on because of the face that he represented in terms of Marvel Comics, because of the speeches he made when he went to universities, about Marvel Comics and modern day mythos in terms of superheroes and so on and so forth. So when you look at this book, and it doesn't it doesn't delve in any of that, it doesn't encapsulate any of those particular moments in terms of a book, so we get a better understanding of Stan Lee. No, this is, hey, let's, he's gone, let's kick him while he's down, and there's nobody and there's no one to corroborate. So as long as I don't say anything specific that may be libelous, I can pretty much put this rubbish out here, and I can, and I can sell a few copies. Again, like Petey said, there's no interview with Roy Thomas. Okay, there's no interview with Larry Lieber. And even if those are like the direct guys, there's no interviews with any of the ancillary guys who would have known this, who would have known that knowledge as well. This is just, hey, let me go for it at the end of the day. And it's a big disservice. I'm glad Roy Thomas spoke out on it. I don't know if there's anyone else who really could. Roy Thomas is a respected comics historian, but I'm glad he spoke on it, out on it. I wish there were maybe some other people who would as well, if they actually had the knowledge. But it's a great disservice to not just Stan Lee, but to Marvel Comics, that they would let, that this type of thing comes out and undercuts, exactly what Marvel Comics was about at the end of the day. And the successful story on the part of Marvel Comics, but also Stan Lee, because this is a guy who's middle management, and he's able to make good on being middle management, because he honestly gets into what he's loving, and it goes from there. Now, the friction he has with Kirby or anybody else, that's a totally different story. If you want to write a book about the friction between Jack Kirby and Stan Lee later on in life, or how things fell apart with him and Ditko or anybody else, that's a totally different book. But if you're going to write the book about a biography on Stan Lee, at the very least, you should be forthright about the life of Stan Lee.
Well, and then this is just to add on. One of the things that like you were last bringing up is the friction between the two of them. Ultimately, outside of being of Stan being the protege of Simon and Kirby, and then taking over Marvel after they left, when they worked together in the outside of a couple of things, of I think rejected issue of the Hulk. I think Hulk 6 was rejected by Stan. Their biggest thing is, I guess I could put this up, where the same writer is talking about the thing that tore them apart, which is the New York Herald Tribune, which was an article that was written on Marvel, and the writer was very much enamored with Stan Lee and totally forgot about Jack Kirby. Now, Jack Kirby over the years changed the story that, to make it look like, I'm sorry to say it, to make it look like Stan planned on him looking good and Jack looking bad, but Stan had no connection with the writer. The guy was writing, he said, hey, have Kirby in there. Kirby said, hey, I would have talked more, but Stan had this mock plotting session, so we already knew the story. And Roy Thomas was there for the meeting. That was not the case. Stan talked, and he said Stan was, gregarious. And then he said Jack Kirby was also talking and also presenting and talking about stuff there. The writer didn't care. The closest thing is that the writer says that Stan has an ESP session with his artists. That says a lot of the collaboration of him telling him and then somehow making it to the page, right? But at the same time, you can't, that this rift that they had was something that Stan didn't really know about. He knew Stan was, of course, the editor. So what he said goes. If he didn't like something or he didn't like a cover, it could be redone, or he would redo it in the office. And at the same time, Jack was kind of like, I don't erase. He kind of just sent books in and that sort of thing. And some books he plotted, which Stan brought up, which, and we'll get into Roy in a second. But then at the same time, Stan didn't necessarily know why Kirby left. He was talking in the press saying, hey, Jack's a writer too, that stuff. Kirby looked at that as like an omission of truth. He finally owned up to it. But it's like this, and then they changed the credit to produced by Stan and Jack, and which was at, I think, Kirby's request. And then ultimately Kirby leaves. And if you read the Rolling Stones article, they had a thing with the whole Marvel, and Stan was literally still broken up that Kirby left. And it's not until Kirby does a slight at Stan in the Mr. Miracle where the relationship changed for Stan, where Stan still accepted Kirby back. Now that's the thing that people have to remember. He's the worst guy on the planet, took all the credit, did all this other stuff, and then you come back to that same company in 75. And then Stan wanted Kirby on the Fantastic Four cartoon. And that ultimately to the detriment of the cartoon, because Kirby didn't really know how to do storyboards, or at least have something like really solid storyboards. But they were working together on the cartoon, which led to them doing the Silver Surfer graphic novel. And Kirby was about to come back again to Marvel, even though the stuff he was doing in the 70s wasn't, heralded as that great. But the original art sort of kept them away, and that made the whole bad blood even worse. So, but you have to remember there's a period where Stan was the editor. The only issue that he brought up was like, hey, this Herald Tribune article. And Stan was like, I didn't know what he was going to write. I didn't know. And then he didn't publicize that they did this article. He left it alone. The writer in this thing, I think it's here, in this article here on the Stanley story that tore apart Marvel Comics, the writer of that thing, I think is Nat Freeland. He says, hey, Stan, you usually promote everything you do. Like, why didn't you promote that article that we did in the Bullpen's bulletin? He said, well, Kirby was upset about it. I'm not going to get him any worse. I'm not going to get him mad. But still, people don't look at that as saying Kirby, Stan is trying to appease Kirby. That it wasn't from Stan's side. And that's one of the things Roy Thomas talked about in the Kirby Collector. There was stuff that wasn't said by Kirby while they worked together that was building up in Kirby that Stan didn't really know about. So the relationship was splitting, but at the same time, Kirby wasn't necessarily saying it. And maybe in that point, they would have figured out something, big, something for it to work out and make it better. But then with, they're asking a lot of Stan because he wasn't the publisher. He could give raises as much as he could, but ultimately he had to go to Martin Goodman, get approval for stuff. So then, and the thing of turning to Stan and say, I'm going to leave, either Kirby and I leave, that's not going to happen. But, he did as much as he could at that point for comics in the 60s. It's not, he's not Neil Adams, but it was comics in the 60s, and he did some things, some revolutionary things, and he did some things that were, the company line, same as Kirby. So, I mean, this rift that they had that built up over time, and ultimately, Stan had to say, Stan had to fight back. He had to say something to Kirby in his the birthday radio interview. He had to say that when Kirby said that he didn't write anything, he had to say, I wrote all the dialogue during this birthday thing. So it's like the rift was something that Kirby was building, and Stan didn't really know where it was coming from because they hadn't really talked about it. And that's one thing people have to remember, that there was a lot of stuff bottled in with Kirby, but he talked to Mark Evaner, he talked to some of the other people about his issues, but the only thing they really talked about was this article in 1966 that led to everything going wrong.
I just want to say one quick thing. With you guys have been pretty on point with a lot of the stuff you're saying. But that period that he returned to Marvel was a short period. Only talking about a 2, 3 year period. It wasn't very long after he left DC, right? So it wasn't like he came back and everything was kumbaya. He stayed there for a little bit, and after that, I guess whatever reasons was that he wanted to leave, he ended up leaving again.
Regretfully, the sales were the major issue. There was issue in the office, not from Stan, because Stan, I think at that point, Stan is in LA. So in the office, they were kind of struggling with, hey, you just giving look, they gave him Captain America. Captain America is close to being canceled. Now you give him these other any book he wants to create, and these aren't
He's
selling. Hmm?
an OG.
I know, but I'm saying for the office, they were kind of like none of this stuff is selling, none of it's working, and they're making fun of it, and that I think at that point Roy is gone. The only person who's sort of the handler is Archie Goodwin, who I think is probably wasn't a part of it, but there was a lot of people kind of making fun of the dialogue at Marvel. They say that sort of thing, but ultimately the books weren't selling. So when he kind of let his contract, lag, he worked again for Marvel through the cartoon, and then through the cartoon, him and I think that's how him and Stan got together to do the graphic novel after that, because he still had some work under his contract to do, and that's I think the last thing he did for Marvel after that point was the graphic novel, the Silver Surfer graphic novel. So yeah, he was there for a short time, but it was mainly because of the sales and a lot of books that that they gave him as sort of and with a big push in ads and whatnot, they just weren't selling.
So,
Mars?
yeah, I mean, I just think that coming the so let's get into the whole thing with this book. It clearly seems slanted towards Kirby. And when we look at Roy Thomas's response in the Hollywood Reporter, of course, Roy Thomas was one of the big supporters of Stan. And it seems, again, he actually says the book is what, 90% good, but there's like 5% that's just totally off in that article. And that needs to be, reassessed in terms of, what actually was going on. Some people may see that as one of Stan Lee's apologists, coming back and trying to rewrite history. I think there's clearly a different ground in terms of what the Kirbyites believe versus the stand. Of course, anybody who's been in public eye for a very long time, people like to slam. All the things they did, they claim all the things they were Machiavellian and stuff over time. And that's how they made it to the thing. But like you said before, I have to agree with you and Cal that the longevity he had in this industry was that he was able to produce. He was able to produce winners and characters and stories that people wanted to buy and were interested in. You know, and
Well,
also that he was the main spokesman for Marvel. He was at those comic
yeah.
conventions. He was at those. I'm speaking to colleges, like Cal was saying. Whereby people got to know him as the face of the company and not everyone else. And let's not forget, prior to I guess what the '70s, the '60s and '70s, when you had the names on all these books and stuff like that, comics prior to that were considered like pulp fiction, right? So you buy it, you throw it away, just like with all
Yes.
those pulp magazine and those pulp books. So we got to look at a time period where people were buying a lot of material, media to read, from these Noir books and I mean all kinds of pulp books. And this is where a lot of these famous writers came from. Where you were producing tons of books. Your name isn't on it. The publisher of the magazine or the thing is on, and they're just burning it through. And like you said, Stan Lee came out and put people's names on it and gave them credit for what they did. And people forget that because back then, it wasn't done in a lot of places. You're just a guy who came in and you just produced for the whole company. You know, which
Well,
does have its appeal if you're starting a company some places, but that's a whole nother conversation. That we could have
well,
later on.
I want to just say that, well, I don't, that goes into a different, I don't want to get into a different topic too far. Just go to Roy. One of the things that people will kind of look at it and going into, even this article is trying to say, yes, to some extent, Roy was Stan's protege, but that would make him no different than the major Kirby historian, which is Mark Evener, who's a Jack Kirby protege. We don't dismiss Mark Evener or any Kirby fan or any who is it? Any of the guys at Image Comics or any of those people, like, oh, well, they're just a Kirby fan. Like, this guy was an editor. This guy differed with Stan. Like, he went under the Stan program, one of the few people that made it out at that period, because Stan was very picky as far as his scripters. And he really, had to make sure that Roy could do it, because he was worried that he had fired a ton of other people. The only person that was acceptable who was his brother, and he had fired a lot of other people that were, we don't know their names anymore. So this is coming from a genuine place. If we give that Mark Evanier is coming from a genuine place in what he believes, we have to believe that Roy is coming from a genuine place. And they have Mark Evanier and Roy have the same mind of how Stan Lee looked at creation and how Kirby looked at creation. They both say it the same way, and they both, in this, now I don't think Mark Evanier says it the same way, but in this article here, when Kirby passed, he says that in conclusion, that those things should be considered created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. The same thing that Roy came to. Now, Mark is a little different now because the snowball effect of Kirby did everything, and Kirby saying that Stan didn't even write, didn't write any dialogue, didn't edit, didn't do anything. So that's one of the things that we can't necessarily, we can't be harsh with those statements that Kirby made, but they can't be substantiated. We can't say when he says that, Kirby says that that Stan, every time they did a story, they talked it over, but it was more him coming in with stuff. When that throws out like Martin Goodman saying he wanted the Fantastic Four, or saying he wanted a group book, or saying he wanted the book, the X-Men, which would be, he said, a group of torches, like a young heroes, or saying he wanted a war comic like the Fantastic Four, that throws out Steve Ditko, throws out Stan Lee's brother, which that was in '85 when Kirby said these things. And a lot of creators, Don Heck, Steve Ditko, Larry Lieber, they all had to say that they did, and Stan had to say that they weren't just somebody on Kirby's back when Kirby couldn't fit a story, and they would work off of his layouts. And that's kind of the thing where someone should have just corrected Kirby at that point, rather than just be like, everything he says is right. Because then the same thing we complained about Stan taking too much credit, that's what Kirby did. He said he did everything, created Spider-Man, drew the first Iron Man comic book. And it's like, no, there's other people involved in the Marvel universe. Other people who didn't work Marvel method, which was Stan Lee's brother. So that's which is the great part, as Cal said about Roy Thomas's article, the pushing back to say, hey, this is not the case of this guy just trying to be somebody who just said, all right, move out the way, Kirby. Like this is all by me, that sort of thing. Because they did interviews together. There was points where Kirby was in the interview with Stan, and Kirby would say, Kirby would say, our books are selling better than those DC books. And Stan was like, no, we're edging, we're getting better. Our sales are creeping up on those guys, Or they talked about, they had points where they interviewed together. They talked about the drug issue in DC. The two of them at the same time. They had it in the Jack Kirby collector. So there's a point where they would talk about things in public, but the camps got too big. Well, Stan had more the fans that didn't know everything, just said Stan did everything. And most fans knew that Kirby most hardcore fans knew Kirby did a lot as far as plotting, and especially the more creative period. But it just got out of hand once the Image guys kind of really sort of promoted Kirby and said, this guy is the guy. And the next thing we're like, damn Stan, he took credit for everything.
Image is going to come in because these guys were, Image has to be the most anti-establishment movement that you've ever seen. Because, everybody gives these guys credit. Oh, they did the whole indie thing. And these guys were, no, you guys were established artists over at Marvel and brought all this stuff over. It's like you guys were the headhunters for some legal company, and you decided just to take all your clientele with you. You didn't do anything from the ground up. But the whole idea with one of the reasons why Kirby or Ditko or Ramita or any of these guys were able to have that amount of freedom was because of Stan. And uh, the whole idea of Stan being an editor, and this part I always find to be incredibly overlooked. If you saw something like Iron Man in the first issue, he's in a gray outfit. And the second issue, he's in a gray outfit. And next thing you know, it changes to gold. That was Stan. Okay, he's pretty much looking at the books, and he would look at the numbers and such and say, you know what? Okay, it's not necessarily here. We need to. This is still working. Let's tinker with this. Let's do that. You would see that over there with certain things in terms of design with say the thing over with the Fantastic Four. But a lot of those are editorial decisions when it comes down. A lot of those are editorial decisions when it comes down. It's no different. The reason why we see Bugs Bunny one way and then he starts looking different as it comes over. It's rarely at that point what the guys doing and say, well, you know what? Let's make Bugs Bunny. Like, no, that's usually higher up saying, can we tweak him a little bit, make him a little bit softer? Can we make Jerry's ears bigger, make him a little bit friendlier? Those are usually editorial decisions, and that's what Stan was also doing at the time. He was also the editor on what? I mean, forget the round table 12 of the Marvel universe is starting. There was all these other books they were producing, and they weren't superhero books, and he was still editor on all of these different titles. So the idea of him writing and editing everything of that nature, Stan was like, look, he said that before. He's like, look, I was doing all of these books. I couldn't write for all of them. So what happens? Because he was working with guys like Kirby and Ditko who could handle it, okay, he said, okay, fine, I can trust these guys to do so. That's where you get the whole Marvel method from, where they'll come, okay, I'm going to give you the plot, okay, you're going to come over here, write this, you're going to come over here, do all the art, and then I'm going to come in and I'm going to fill in all the dialogue. Kirby wanted to go so far as say he wasn't even doing the dialogue. And it's very obvious that, look, you can tell something that Stan Lee did in terms of dialogue or even writing, okay, as opposed to somebody else, because we've seen Kirby's dialogue on the new guy. It's just a totally different scene. But that part over there doesn't seem to be given enough of a view, saying, look, he didn't have to do any of that. He could have came over here, banged out scripts and such, and said, look, I'm going to trust you guys to come over here, do this. Okay, if he didn't like it as editor, he was going to come over here and scale it back. But then a lot of the other stuff in terms of the numbers, because there's still the art and everything that's coming over in story, but still as an editor, you're looking like, okay, where are our numbers on these particular books? All right, we want to get them to here. What changes need to be made? What's going to happen over here? So if he's telling Kirby, hey, I want a story where the Fantastic Four, goes against God or something of that nature, that means he's looked at the last 4 or 5 books, okay, and he's checking, look, what stories over here really spiked with readership? These type of stories, okay, let's come back and do these type of stories over here. So not just the whole idea of the writing or even the gestation of, look, well, let's try this type of character, this type of character, or let's merge these type of characters, but also the aspect of being a top-notch editor he's there with with like Mort Weisinger, Julie Schwartz. These guys who were like really top-notch editors, and that part is also totally overlooked. And it's not being stating the facts as to what went on. It's not being an apologist for either side. It's stating the facts for what went on. Okay, you can't come out and say, well, Stan didn't do anything. That's just totally false. Okay, but you also have to understand where Kirby was at that time when he's making that a statement. This is not a guy who's the happiest camper at the day. Okay, if he was at Marvel, okay, and he had a similar situation to Stan, do you think would he have been coming out? Well, Stan didn't do anything. No, he was in a situation at the time where he was not happy about stuff or about the way that things were in terms of his relationship with Marvel. Not Stan's relationship with Marvel necessarily, but his relationship with Marvel. And if you don't take that into account, if it's just, oh, Stan stole credit, well, let's just look, where was Kirby at this particular point, or anybody else for that matter? Okay, and then in the same breath, you have situations where I think there was something where Roy Thomas said he was having a discussion with Stan, and Stan, I won't say begrudgingly, but it was almost like Stan became befuddled because he couldn't find a way to give credit for some of the things, because I guess in his mind he was like, well, it was my idea. It's my idea. So even if Kirby makes the design and everything, I'm the one who came up with the idea. So how much, I'm going to give him credit for this? And, it was my idea at the end of the day. So you have those parts too. which is a purely, human position to take. It is your idea, but that's something you can hash out in discussion. But to come over and, well, no, he can't have it both ways. He stole everything. He didn't do any. He stole everything. He didn't do anything. I didn't get it. I didn't get any credit. Stole all of the credit, and somehow this guy is this guy has to be the most talentless hack that ever existed, with the exception of Eric Larson. And then now we're over here.
Oh God.
Now we're over here.
That's a low blow, bro. Low blow.
Yeah,
I'll allow it. We could really cut you off while you're on a roll. I will. The only thing I will add, the one thing that that Roy pointed out, and that Mark Evener used to point out, is that there were other plots. There wasn't just Fantastic Four #1, which they act like Stan mysteriously made up and put so people could find it. It was, as Roy said, he saw a friend of his had Fantastic Four #8. But Mark Evener, in the comics interview, he said that Kirby kept every plot that Stan did. And at some point, people have forgotten he said that. And there's also the saying that Mark Evener said that he read a bunch of plots. He said he read the plot for Avengers 4, the one where Captain America appears. So there are plots out there, and I'm pretty sure they're mulched by the Kirby family. But at the same time, I don't find them to be that you can see the changes that Kirby added stuff. We already heard Stan say that Kirby was coming in stories on his own. At some point, Stan would say, "Hey, just do Dr. Doom." So we know he was involved in the plotting process. We know that Kirby was the thing, but the take and say that Stan did nothing is just so wrong. And at the same time, Steve Ditko, Stan stopped talking to Steve Ditko before he left Spider-Man. And Steve Ditko's still saying that early on, even though the credits are listed as writers, Stan gave me a synopsis. He usually gave me a 1 to 2 page synopsis up until issue 18, right? So they would talk over stuff, this, that, and the other. And at some point, he was, writing it on his, basically plotting on his own. And then that's when he asked for plotting credit. But he says early on, Stan, like at least, definitely the first 10 to 12 issues, that Stan was sending him a plot. And they'd worked that way on the Atlas books. And then there's other historians that say most of the time, the only time you see Stan writing is when you see him sign his name. And most of the time he signed his name was with Steve Ditko. And he also signed his name on the Atlas book, which was the Rawhide Kid, which he did with Kirby. And I say that's one of their first, not ones with bigger numbers. But most of the time Stan signed whatever he did. That's how the credits happened, because he would sign whatever he specifically wrote. And then that just became part of what he did at Marvel, the Marvel age of comic books. But to discount that all the plots were just some sort of thing that Stan did to substantiate him as a writer, he did later, that he would sit in the office, make a plot, and then leave it out in the office and say, "Oh, how did that plot get here?" After the fact. It's like saying this, or having a protege tell these Kirby stories that can't be backed up. And that's what the Roy Thomas article is about. You can't back up the stuff that they're just saying that, Kirby didn't work from any plots. All this stuff just came from him. When, as I think as Cal saying, when Kirby was in good and the Captain America rights came up, he went to court with Marvel saying everything Joe Simon did was within Marvel in the 40s. He backed Marvel, when at the same time, Simon would later let him know, it's like, you have a creator stake in Captain America. You co-created with me. Anything, if I got, when you're supposed to get money too out of Marvel. So that's the thing. When he was in good with them, he was in good with them, so.
Well, it helps when you're not suing somebody. When you're not suing them, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can get done.
Yeah.
When you're suing them, that's when all these walls come up and talk to my attorney and hey, you know, every word has to be managed, and a lot of that stuff. Well, that's the disappointing thing. Uh, a lot of that stuff could have been managed, to be quite honest, with 2 or 3 better phone calls,
Mm.
as opposed to, you know, acerbic interviews where where you're slating people or you're taking shots at people with funky flash man, those
Yeah.
type of things. But for the for the record and for the history, I hope people tell it straight, because if anything, the last couple of years have really shown me how much people love to suck in the gaslighting, and they'll just go with it, and this becomes a story, and you get like, no, that's not the story. Okay, and I think it's very important to keep that preserved, because a lot of the cats who were around then, they're not around. They're not around now. Okay, there are less and less of them, and I mean like the comic book community that I was growing up with, not the same today, especially not when you can go on the internet and find a whole screed about Stan Lee the thief. And you're like, oh wow, you can just keep going down the rabbit hole with more and more stuff on Stan Lee the thief, and never go to read anything else, or even think that there's anything else to read at the end of the day. So I really hope, and well, I guess a lot of it's going to be on Marvel as well. They'll probably do more and less at the end of the day, if only because it suits their bottom line. But I hope more is done just to tell the story, just to tell what happened. Okay. And you can tell what happened, warts and all. Okay. But, tell what happened and give credit, give credit where credit was due, and leave it at that. It's not a him versus him sort of thing. It is what it is. This is where it was. This is what happened. And the biggest thing that always gets me is that none of these guys, even when they're selling books, even when these comic books become popular, none of these guys ever imagined that it would become as big as it is. And that's, I'm saying, like, when they had the Incredible Hulk on TV, they weren't oh wow, we actually got the Hulk on TV. That was something else I wanted to mention, because they wanted to slate. Oh, look at all the, he couldn't get the movies out, and he couldn't do this. He couldn't. I'm like, what are you people stupid? The Lord of the Rings. They tried to make a movie for the Lord of the Rings for decades, and they kept saying no to it because they didn't have the technology to pull it off. The best that they were able to do was the animated cartoon. It was supposed to be 2 parts. They did one. They did one, and they didn't come back to it at the end of the day. They didn't have the technology. You look at any of the early stuff. Hulk, the Hulk had to be a bodybuilder, okay, with the wig on. Spider-Man was swinging from rope. You look at those type of things. That all of these things that they were doing early on, because this was the best that they can do. We didn't have the type of computers. Didn't have computer-generated animation. Didn't have. You have all of these leaps and bounds in terms of technology, in terms of costuming, all of that stuff, and the approach. But that's from these guys trying and failing so many times, and people looking at it to say, okay, why didn't this work? Okay, we can come over here. And throughout the whole thing, you still have Stan Lee as a cheerleader, saying, look, we can get this stuff done. That's how we got Blade. It was Stan Lee and Wesley Snipes who said, oh, they didn't say die on the whole thing. We get that. And they're like, hey, look, Blade. And the thing is, even with Blade being successful, they still never think that it's going to be as big as it is when it hits. When Blade went, I'm pretty certain they did the normal thing of, well, yeah, this is good. Maybe we can pull some more films out. Did they ever really think they were going to have the cinematic universe that they have right now? No. Probably go ahead and do some films here, do some films there. It is now, those guys back in 61 to actually think, yeah, I better get my lawyer, make certain I get full credit, because in 2021, this is going to be a juggernaut. Nobody, nobody thinks like that. And these are the same guys working in a medium who knew exactly what happened to Siegel and Schuster with Superman. They didn't think that was going to happen at the end of the day. And at the same point, nobody was still doing it. Comics are for kids, okay? It, you know, it, that type of stuff always, astounds me, that nobody ever seems to look at it. These are guys who are working, they're having a good time with what they're doing, okay? And then it takes off from there. Okay, and of course, if you feel left out on it, you're not necessarily going to have the best disposition.
Yeah, I mean, to have that foresight to know that, I mean, Kirby isn't someone that was new to the comic industry. He was a publisher. He was obviously a creator, but he was the half of, I mean, he wasn't the business half of Simon and Kirby, but they did publish books. They did have properties that didn't necessarily go anywhere, that you just push, at the end of the day, when they split, they split up the last of the properties. And that's how you have, the Challengers, which was a possible Simon and Kirby book that Kirby did on his own with other writers. But that's the no one. There wasn't some point where Simon came and with the success of the least comic book success of the Challengers, say, oh, it's selling. They want to put it into a regular series. He didn't come and say, we got that, that's mine. I own half of it. I created it with Kirby. We were planning on doing that for Harvey. So it's like, and that's the thing. One other thing that Cal was bringing up is like the bad blood of the original art really pushes Kirby outside of them. And whether that's definitely the bad part on Marvel of trying to hold that old artwork. But then it just turns into Kirby just taking shots at Stan when his issue is with the company, the people that own Marvel, and they're just like, we don't want to give up this old artwork because this is our, this is the thing right here. And they're like, you can't keep it because it's, they got to pay money for that. Like there's a taxes on it alone, so.
So, gentlemen, so basically, just want to review some facts. You think that the book has some credence, but is not 100% accurate.
No, we're not being nice like Roy was. Don't buy it. Don't buy it. There's a ton of other things that you could buy. At least even the Sean Howe book about Marvel. At least they have something about that Martin Goodman was involved. Like this was a team effort, and the only reason why the team got so small is because Martin Goodman fired everybody.
This is the Marvel Comics: The Untold Story by Sean Howe.
Yeah, that book. Yes, so that has Martin Goodman involved there somewhere, and it talks about Stan. I don't think they talk too much about Stanley's brother. But I mean, like you go around for your history, and at this point, this book should have everything. It should have the warts side of Kirby also. It shouldn't just be the warts are that everybody treated him bad. The warts of him, siding with Marvel, being there, and then when he didn't like some things like Stan doing the Silver Surfer without him, but he didn't address it. So it's like you have to look at it and say, Kirby also had a history of, legally blowing it at DC. That's what led him to not work at DC anymore. Because it's like Marvel, he left Marvel in a bad way. And then he left DC in a bad way. So he went back to Marvel after years of not working for Marvel. Like literally since the 40s. He doesn't return to Marvel until like about 15 years later. Like maybe even more than that. Like maybe 17. Or no, maybe I guess it'd be more like 12 because it's like the late mid 40s, something like that. So 12 to 15 years gap between him and Marvel. So, and that's only because everything with DC blew up in his face. So, we got to factor some of that in, and we haven't had, everyone kind of explains it in a certain way, saying, hey, well, Kirby was like this, and Kirby had a way of talking, and there's like mistakes are mistakes. It happens. Sorry. And I'm a huge fan.
Cal, do you have anything else to add to that before we
What about Kirby? Kirby's Kirby. If the only thing that can get you into Kirby is how he got ripped off by Stan Lee supposedly, then I recommend that you go back, look at the art. If you can get some, well, I mean, you probably can't afford to buy it, but if you can go and get one of those trades that give you like the early Fantastic Four stories, or Thor, those early Thor stories, and really get an idea of what this guy was doing. This is the guy who had characters leaping off the page. They were literally leaping off the page. They would throw a punch and the fist couldn't be seen anymore. Why? Because he was like, no. He was not bound by that. And that's where you really want to have your mind in terms of Kirby and his contributions to art. And with Stan, again, with those great ideas, collaboration, top-notch, top-notch editing, that's where our head should be at the end of the day. But this book, put it like this. If I gave you a glass and told you that glass was 95% champagne and 5% monkey piss, you wouldn't drink it. Okay? You wouldn't drink it. You wouldn't come over and say, well, it's only 5% monkey piss. This book, okay, is monkey piss. Don't drink it.
It's not a curse word. I'll just say that. It's not a curse word.
Well, I'm sorry for even asking for your opinion at the very end. So, ladies and gentlemen, hey, anybody's free to write what they want to write. If you really want to find out more information, you really should try and read more stuff about this stuff. There's a lot of books talking about Marvel Comics, DC, about Jim Lee and not Jim Lee, sorry, about Stan Lee. Stan Lee.
You talk about his brother Jim, that great X-Men artist.
So listen, guys, if you like what you see, give it a big thumbs up, comment. Hope to see you guys in the YouTube verse. Spin a rack, out.
Almost out. Almost out. I'll have to run out of battery power. Stop sharing and